Let's have a look at this headline in the Financial Times. You heard again at the start of the programme, Shell profits more than double to record $40 billion. Let's talk about this with our business editor, Simon Jack. Hello to you, Simon. Can you give us a bit of context to these figures? People will be thinking, oh, surely they're paying millions, hundreds of millions in tax.
Two things. It's the highest profit in their 115-year history. It is, by my reckoning, the highest profit ever recorded by any UK company. And obviously, it's because of soaring oil and gas prices. They were already rising last year. They started soaring when Russia invaded Ukraine, shutting off oil and gas supplies from Russia. Now, as far as the tax goes, they paid £100 million in UK tax in 2022. They say they're going to pay £400 million in tax in 2023. And people will say, well, that's peanuts compared to the profits they're making. A couple of things to bear in mind. 95% of their profits are made and taxed elsewhere, outside the UK. They do very little business here, actually, in these shores and waters. And secondly, they are allowed to offset, quite legally, decommissioning costs from taking apart old oil rigs and investing in more oil and gas resources in the UK against those profits. So they don't do much here, and what they do, they can offset some investments here. So that's why the number will be small. Not big enough, I imagine, to stop people complaining that they are not paying nearly enough tax. Another thing I think people will notice is they paid more in share buybacks and dividends, giving money to their shareholders, than they did in renewable projects. That, I think, they'll come under a lot of pressure for.
What was the figure in terms of dividends?
£5 billion in dividends and share buybacks, and they're saying they're going to do the same again next year. Now, some of those dividends and some of that money going out to shareholders will go to pension funds. If you have a pension, the chances are you own some shares in Shell. It's one of the biggest listed companies in the FTSE 100. Some people have divested out of fossil fuels, but pension funds do still rely on these jumbo dividends to help pay out their pension liabilities.
Just to bring our audience the news in the last few minutes or so, the interest rates have gone up. That was expected. They've gone up for the 10th month in a row by 0.5%. They are now at 4%. What is that going to mean for people with mortgages and households or credit card loans?
Well, it's good news for savers. We shouldn't forget about them. There are as many savers as borrowers, more in fact. And for people who are coming off fixed-rate mortgages, and there's 1.8 million of those in the country, they will be looking at slightly higher mortgage bills. Although I don't think today's rate rise will make much difference, because most lenders had already factored this into their calculations. Much more interesting, I think, is the fact that the bank said two things. It said this might be it. They were expected to go up to 4.5%, even 5-6% during the Truss administration. This could be, or very nearly, it for rate rises. The bank also said there would be a recession this year in 2023, but it would be shorter and milder than thought. They also scaled down where they thought unemployment would get to, but they said there are still some labour market pressures because not enough people have returned to the workforce after COVID, whether they're in their over 50s, etc., in touching distance of their final salary pension scheme. But generally, pretty good news for the Bank of England. Yes, recession possibly in 2023, but shorter and less severe than previously thought.
Simon Jack, thank you very much. Are you celebrating, Matt, Shell's record profits?
No, I don't think anyone's celebrating these record profits. They are good news in some senses, obviously, for pension funds. Obviously, companies doing well in principle is a really good thing. But the manner in which Shell is making these profits are through circumstances that no one would have wished on anybody. I think that's part of the reason why you've already got a windfall tax from the UK government that's been increased by Jeremy Hunt.
You were under a lot of pressure to do that, though, weren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that's because it was the right thing to do. The fact that Jeremy Hunt did it is the right thing. If more of these profits were being made in the UK, or there wasn't that incentive to invest in renewables, then I think lots more people across the political spectrum would be saying go further.
What was your reaction when you heard the record profits?
Well, I just think that we really need to look at putting a proper windfall tax in, removing those tax breaks, going more in line with where we are in Europe. I tend to agree with Lisa Nandy on that. We heard her speaking about it.
She was there in the headlines.
Yeah, and I think the fact that, yes, incentives to invest in green energy, but less money spent on green energy than paid in dividends, that will be alarming to a lot of people who are really struggling to heat their homes and who are looking at that cap on energy bills ending in April.
Right. When you say a proper, I think you said windfall tax, I think it's at 75%, the extended windfall tax brought in by the government. What more would you like to see?
Labour is saying that we need to bring this more in line with what's happening in Europe, and we need to be taking away those tax breaks that they're taking advantage of. And you know, this is not anything that these companies aren't expecting. It's nothing that these companies weren't expecting to post these profits, and I think they expect to pay proper tax.
Well, do you agree with that?
Well, I think you are seeing some of the big energy companies adjusting how much they end up spending on renewables, how much they end up investing as a result of paying higher taxes. So it's a balance, and what I think the government should be doing is trying to extract the maximum possible investment into renewables, into making our energy supply more secure, as well as going as far as they reasonably can on the windfall tax.
Kim, is that enough?
No, as I said, I think we need to look at these tax breaks that they're still taking advantage of and take them away. I mean, I think most people want to see their energy bills come down, and this is how we're going to pay for it.
I mean, there is a problem, isn't there, Tom? You hear $40 billion. I accept Simon Jack's point that 95% of it is outside the UK, at a time, though, when households here are continuing to face soaring energy bills, and the rate of tax or the level or the amount just doesn't feel big enough.
But isn't that the problem? That only 5% of these profits are being made in the UK? That's only £2 billion out of £40 billion. Why are only £5 billion of these profits being made or 5% of these profits being made in the UK? Well, could it be that we've slapped a 75% tax on these companies? One of the highest windfall taxes in the world. It's on top of a 30% corporation tax, which has a 10% supplementary, then had a 25% windfall on that then got extended to a 35% windfall, making 3/4 of that profit taxed. Is it any wonder that they're not doing as much business in this country, and 95% of their business is elsewhere, making tax revenue for other countries, tax revenue for Canada, for the United States, for Indonesia, for Argentina? These are their big markets. We're not a big market for them because we're taxing them to the hilt.
Nadine?
I think ultimately it comes down to an ideological argument about how we supply energy. You know, this is how the free market works. Energy was privatised. This is inevitably how it is, because these companies operate for profit. If the public are dissatisfied with the way that this works, you know, BP and these oil companies, Shell, they're more than entitled to make these huge profits. If we want to have an energy system in this country where people feel like they're getting value for money, they feel like the profits are being reinvested into infrastructure, into the public, and they don't feel like they're being exploited, then we need to look at the way in which we manage our energy supply. And I think this has been something that has come up time and time and again. I think it's obviously ideologically difficult, particularly for somebody like Rishi Sunak, who is a kind of student of Thatcher. But again, you know, Labour's also bringing in, thinking of, you know, if they get in power, to start Great British Energy, of this kind of producing energy at home and not exporting it abroad. So I just wonder if ideologically people are shifting back towards maybe nationalised energy and, you know, supplying energy for ourselves and not allowing this money to go elsewhere is better.
Are you out of touch on this, Matt?
Well, I think there is obviously a huge shift towards the importance of energy security. We've seen that. Great British Energy from Labour is to some extent a response to that. The government has a different approach but is trying to tackle the same problem. I think the idea, though, that as Nadine sort of hints, that we should be nationalising this company is not practical. These are global businesses that simply would say, well, as Tom says, we're going to be doing less in the UK. So I think you can have ideological arguments, but sometimes they meet reality, and you have to adjust accordingly.
Right. I mean, Labour's response was, at one point, to look at nationalising it, but no longer.
No, I think, well, Keir Starmer said that if we're in power, we'll establish Great British Energy, which is...
It's not quite the same as, you know, completely dismantling the energy market, is it?
No, but we need to be making more of our own energy in this country, and you know, and that's what we need to be doing. And I think kind of the argument that Shell makes so little profit, pays so little tax because it makes so little profit here. I think if we go back 2 years, they didn't pay any tax in the UK, and so clearly that doesn't necessarily stack, and that's not acceptable to the British people, particularly when their bills are so high. And I think often what we need to bring this back down to is the household level. What are people experiencing in their homes day to day? And far too many of my residents.
And does that mean that they will be doing what Nadine said, the cultural change away from this sort of...
I'd like to ask Nadine if Labour supports extending new oil and gas licences for Shell so they can do more drilling in the North Sea, so that they can create more tax revenues that can go to HMRC, that can fund the public services in this country. Is that something that the Labour Party would support?
We've got to move away from fossil fuels. We are far too reliant on it, and that is part of why we're in the financial situation that we're in.
But there is also a separate question around the idea that a windfall tax is going to make the government's support for energy bills unnecessary is simply bad maths. The vast majority of support has come from central government. It will continue to come from central government. A windfall tax may well be a small part of that solution, but it is never going to be the whole thing, and that's because these are global challenges.
Nadine?
As I said, I think it all goes back to, where the public are when it comes to the production of energy. And I think, we've seen a lot of this kind of, over the last few years about making things British, producing our own things, being self-sustainable. And I think this is why Labour's approach on energy, I think, will be appealing to the public, because it's the idea of being in control of the energy that we produce here and having that level of autonomy over it. So I do just think we're having a bit of a crisis here of how do we produce our energy and how do we want to and how do we want those profits to be used.
Well, and part of that crisis may be what you alluded to earlier, all of you. The Daily Telegraph headline says BP to cut back on green shift amid booming demand for fossil fuels. Again, it's this idea, Tom, that companies are exploiting to some extent so much of the sort of outfall of the Ukraine war. How does that look to people watching, that they are going to focus more on fossil fuels while it's going to bring them a great return?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting situation that, of course, is a harrowing one, and the obvious solution to all of this is to get a quick end to that war in Ukraine that I think everyone wants to see. And I think most people will be sitting back and thinking about the British government and how well it's done in terms of spurring the international coalition to provide tanks to Ukraine, but also raise an eyebrow as to why the UK government is not providing jets to Ukraine, which they've asked for. And I think that there are some big questions over that issue. At the moment, the government's line, which it seems to be an incredibly feeble one, is saying that these jets are too complicated for the Ukrainian army to use. This is an army that's held back, an army that's far larger and has been planning this invasion for a long time. Are we seriously, as Britain, saying that the Ukrainians can't use our equipment? Well, it's a really big question for the government.
I feel like that's a bit of a tangent to go off on when it comes to talking about, profits and the way in which energy companies are operating. Like, you are right, the end of the war in Ukraine will, provide some relief. But ultimately, this is about business practices. If there were any other global crisis that has affected oil prices, they probably would have done the same thing. But again, this comes down to ideology and free markets. They are more than entitled to...
What about the energy market in the UK is free?
No, but the way in which companies operate, they're more than entitled to send their money to shareholders. They're more than entitled to exploit. They're not regulated as they would be if they were nationalised. But that's how it works.
Can we please remember exactly what was going on over the summer when this country was dashing around the world, going to places like Qatar and the UAE and trying to get extra gas exports to this country, because otherwise we're facing a big problem. We've been buying huge amounts of gas exports from the United States as well. So doesn't it make sense, therefore, that these companies want to produce more of that stuff because the international price is so high? That's how the market works.
Well, that's the point, though.
What's your opposite solution? That we just sit back and allow these very high prices to be subsidised by pretend money for evermore?
Well, but the government wants them to make... Yes, the government wants them to make a transition, though, to more investment into renewables, but they won't, will they? Why they can make so much money out of fossil fuels?
We are seeing a huge shift globally towards more renewable energy, but it is always going to be a transitional period, and we can't, as Tom sort of says, we can't wish away the fact that there is huge necessity globally for fossil fuels at the moment.
Right, a question now just come out, in fact I can put to both of you, Kim and Matt, is that Andrew Bailey, head of the Bank of England, the governor there, has said inflation has turned a corner. Are your constituents feeling that?
I think the answer is not yet,
No.
but I do think people have, if I measure it by my own inbox, then there is a plateauing of people talking about that as a particular issue. That would reflect where we are. But this is the most important issue facing Joe and Joanna Public right now, inflation.
Right. Your response?
Yeah, I don't think that the public are feeling like inflation is going in the right direction yet. I think there's a long way to go. And actually, I would really like to see government being a lot more ambitious. I think Rishi Sunak said he would halve inflation. that's less ambitious than the Bank of England themselves, who think it should be around 2%. And so we need to be supporting the public where they're really struggling with rising costs. And I think the thing that we have to remember, certainly for a lot of my constituents, I represent the area in the country that has the highest level of child poverty. There's a lot of people who are feeling the pinch of rising costs and who were struggling before we got here. And so, turning that round for them takes more than dealing with the inflation. It takes dealing with the pound in their pocket more broadly.